We're going to talk about, again, global markets, how you reconcile that with local rules, and I'm really pleased to be joined here by Chris Parker. Chris is on the left as we sit up here. Chris is the agricultural counselor at the Australian Embassy here in Washington, has had really a lot of interesting perspectives on the field of farming and food. He's been a wool and grain farmer in Australia, an advisor to the federal government. Told me last night he oversaw border operations for biosecurity, but we're not allowed to talk about that here. And very interesting perspective, as you'll hear, because Australia has taken a very, very different approach from the U.S. around agriculture. Next to Chris, Scott Faber. Scott's Vice President of Government Affairs at Environmental Working Group. Very active, very influential environmental group that does a lot of work around food and ag issues, has helped shape farm bills in the past. And we haven't met until just now, but I know Scott and EWG have strong points of view on what should and shouldn't be in the farm bill. We'll talk a little bit about that. And John Dardis, we want to treat him like a welcome guest. He's here representing the EU, which has been beaten up on a bit. But in all fairness, John is the first Secretary for Agriculture and Food at the Ireland Embassy. He's not going to speak for the entire EU. He's going to speak out of his own experience, which includes a PhD in wheat breeding from North Carolina State. Go Wolfpack. And John was a wheat farmer in Ireland, am I right? Or your family was in the wheat farming business? Still am. So again, seen it from the farming side, the regulatory side, and worked in Brussels as well for a while as part of the EU structure. I think I want to start with you first, Chris, because Australia has taken such a different path from the US, and I'd love for you to explain why and how. In the agricultural sector, to some degree, and hopefully you can clarify this for people here, the government has pulled out dramatically from interfering in farm and food markets. There's an absence of direct payments, crop insurance, etc. So you've sort of said, let's let markets work in the agricultural sector. And maybe we'll save this for the second question, but just to plant the thought with you, also dramatically different from the US, you've decided that you will impose a tax on carbon in Australia. So you've sort of said markets work okay for agriculture, they don't work as well for energy, environmental externalities. But let's just start with the agriculture part. How and why did that happen, and how's it going?
Well, I'm glad you started with the agriculture part, because I'm quite a bit more comfortable with that part.
Okay.
Look, I'm not an economist. As a veterinarian and farmer and pretend bureaucrat, and certainly try to be a diplomat at times, some of the economic rationalisation around that I'm going to probably be quite simple about. Over many years, successive Australian governments has taken the position that we really should not be in the place of subsidising particularly farmers. And over probably at least 40 years, we've seen successive industries become deregulated. The most recent one was the dairy industry in Australia. And the government gets out of that process. So we've seen very much a move amongst our farmers in Australia towards the marketplace. Australia actually exports over 60% of the agricultural produce that we produce in Australia. So very much a focus on world markets and very much a focus on export markets. So in that sense, yes, we've let the market decide. I think it's interesting when you talk to farmers, as I do regularly, and farmers in Australia often say, well, you know, it's nice to have some of those subsidies that in Europe and certainly in the US, but on the other hand, they say, well, maybe it's best they keep them and we'll keep getting more and more efficient. So there's a genuine feeling amongst, I think, particularly those industries in Australia that are export focused, that the lack of subsidies leads to an extremely efficient farming sector. And I think that the sorts of productivity growth we've seen in Australia over the last probably 15 or 20 years, although flattening out a little bit now, I must be honest, is an indication of just how some of those efficiencies come through.
And Chris, why did it happen? I mean, was this a sort of taxpayer-driven move, or was something else going on?
Look, I think like all these things, it's multifactorial. I mean, if it's the movement started probably before I was even voting or even understanding these issues, to be honest. And I think, you know, as successive Australian governments realised the size of the Australian economy meant that to be able to provide subsidies to large sections of the Australian economy was really not going to be sustainable in the long term if we were going to see the sorts of productivity growth within the economy, but more broadly, that I think we have seen. There's also, I think, very much with export-focused agricultural industries in Australia, we've always been certainly a player in the WTO, and certainly what we've really pushed is this whole idea of reducing barriers to trade. And it's very hard to pursue that particular train of argument within international organisations if you're not actually practising what you preach. And I think there's a number of things that have come together over time, and it is extremely expensive to subsidise industries, and it's not a place where the Australian people or successive Australian governments felt they wanted to be spending their money.
And the process of withdrawing the subsidies, what kind of dislocation resulted? Was there any effort to sort of transition people away from them? Was there a consolidation in any sectors? Just if you can, I'm sure it's a complicated story, but give us a summary of how that went.
Sure. Well, probably the one the most recent one would be the deregulation of the dairy industry in Australia. And by deregulation, I mean government got out of any form of price support, any form of price setting, so completely removed itself from the marketplace. That's painful. It's painful in a policy sense, and it's extremely painful for the communities that are affected by it. The Australian government at the time decided that it would put a levy on everyone, every consumer of milk, and that was 11 cents on every litre, and that was to pay for a dairy restructuring program, and that cost $1.94 billion, which is quite a bit in an economy the size of Australia. And it was used to provide direct assistance to dairy producers. It was used to provide exit assistance to dairy producers. But more importantly, it was also used to provide money for communities that were affected as well, to have a look at how they might restructure their community, how they might think about new industries coming into their areas and those sorts of things. So they are painful, and they're painful not just for the communities. They are painful things for government. And interestingly, it was a right-wing government in Australia that actually put forward that levy, which is unusual. But it recognised in the sense that there were genuine structural benefits to the Australian economy, and they recognised the best way to do that was to share the pain, as in the cost, as widely as possible across the community, and that was the decision of the government at the time. And, whether it's successful or not, it depends on how you measure success. We saw a reduction in the number of dairy farmers in Australia. So if you measure success by having lots of dairy farmers, then it wasn't successful. But if you measure success by an increase in the production of milk in Australia, and certainly an increase in the amount of milk that was exported out of Australia, or dairy products that were exported out, then it was a resounding success. And the marketplace now decides the price it's going to pay for milk. And that, there is still pain in some of those communities.
Last question, we could go on, but I want to move along. Was there a sunset provision attached to that restructuring levy?
Yeah, they were paid for 8 or 9 years, and I think the levy finished up about 6-7 years ago.
Oh, so it's gone now.
The levy is now gone because there's no more money to be, in fact, as part of that package, to be providing structural adjustment assistance for those communities affected.
So Scott, EWG sort of famously, transparently published the size and the amount and the names of farmers in the U.S. who were getting direct payments, and I think people here in Washington would say that probably played some role in the end of direct payments. We've now moved to a different system. I don't know if you think it's better or worse. We can ask, but what do you think of what you're hearing from Chris about the Australian transition?
Sure. Well, and just to be clear, we are still providing direct payments this year. Both the House and Senate farm bills anticipate ending direct payments. But what's troubling to, I assume many of you in the room, to our trading partners, is that much of the savings that will be achieved from finally ending subsidies that were created, ironically, to wean farmers off subsidies, but then became an entitlement on their own, much of the savings that come from ending those subsidies are now being plowed into far more trade-distorting subsidies in the form of expanding our crop insurance program. And so much of in particular, much of the savings will go to increase the level of coverage that farmers can obtain from 85 to 90%. And I'm sure, as many of you know, the government already pays 2/3 of the premium support that allows farmers to buy a variety of crop insurance tools. Both the House and Senate farm bills would use much of the savings from eliminating direct payments to further expand both the kinds of coverages that farmers can buy to allow them to buy, instead of 85% coverage, 90% coverage, and also to essentially pay part of their deductible to provide shallow loss payments. And so it's hard to imagine something that could be more production enhancing or more trade distorting than injecting more subsidies into our crop insurance programs. But you can always count on the House and Senate Agriculture Committees to come up with that. And they, of course, have. And they've, in addition to dramatically sweetening the subsidies for crop insurance, which already cost taxpayers about $9 billion a year, $11 billion last year, we've increased some of the price guarantees, the sort of traditional price guarantees that we've provided farmers. So in many, and then just to make matters worse, we've cut some of the other programs, especially the conservation programs that are clearly green box. So I think when you step back and look at the bills that have been produced by both our House and Senate Agriculture Committees, they really are a step back from where we were headed in the 96 and 2002 farm bills, and are going to make it ultimately much harder for us to be a leader, as Chris said, and really walk the walk with regards to reducing these sorts of trade distorting subsidies.
Scott, I don't mean to interrupt, but explain why crop insurance is trade distorting in some way. I thought it was just to protect farmers against, extreme weather, et cetera.
And I think most of us would think of insurance the way you would think of insurance, that if you have homeowners insurance or car insurance, your house burns down, you crash your car, the government's going to make you whole. But what we've created is essentially a series of revenue insurance programs or revenue protection programs that don't simply don't address the risks associated with a flood or other kind of events created by weather, but that really help guarantee the revenue that and the business income of some of the largest and most successful farm businesses in the country. And because it's insurance and because the premium support is unlimited, you have this result where there are now a handful of farm businesses that receive annually more than $1 million in premium support. There are about 10,000 who receive more than $100,000 in policyholders who receive more than $100,000 annually in premium support. While, of course, maybe not of course, but while the bottom 80% of recipients get about $5,000 a year. So it's not only production enhancing, it's incredibly inequitable. And unlike most of the other subsidies that we've historically provided farmers, it's not transparent. So while we have been able until now to tell you who receives direct payments, countercyclical payments, disaster payments, conservation payments, and you could find that on our website, Congress has explicitly prohibited us from knowing who receives premium support, crop insurance premium support. And so I can tell you a lot about the kinds of crops and the amounts, the indemnities paid, counties, and so on. I can't tell you whether I've gotten that premium support or whether any of you have gotten that premium support because Congress won't let us.
And Scott, how do you, again, maybe I'm reading outdated stories, but I thought there was a ceiling on the level of premium support.
There's not, and there are and what's ironic, and I think what sort of stunning to many senators, and they'll maybe debating this as early as today, is that while we have put caps on the amount of subsidies like direct payments and countercyclical payments and some of the new subsidies that are proposed by the Senate and the House, there's no limit whatsoever on the amount of premium support that a farmer can get from RMA. Senators Shaheen and Toomey will be offering an amendment to cap that at $50,000. We expect similar amendments in the House. That's similar to the caps that have been applied to other traditional subsidy programs. But right now, and some of you, anyone want to raise their hand? I didn't think so. Many farmers are getting hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars in premium support.
So that's fascinating. Didn't answer the question though. So what do you think of what happened? No.
I wanted the question.
No. I seriously meant it's fascinating. I'm glad you laid that all out for us. But what do you think of the Australia experience, having heard what Chris said?
I think clearly Australia demonstrated that agriculture can be extremely competitive and productive in the absence of subsidies. America has a very different relationship with our farmers. We've been providing them income support in some way or another since the 1930s. And so I think the great likelihood is that we'll continue to provide subsidies, especially premium support for farmers for the foreseeable future. The real question, and the one that the Senate's going to be debating this week, or maybe it's a week after next, and the House will be debating next month, is just how much premium support. Do we need to provide 2/3 of the cost of an insurance premium for farmers? If we provided 1/3, would farmers still purchase insurance so that we wouldn't have to go back to the bad old days of providing disaster payments? Is it 1/3? Is it 40%? What's the number, the amount of subsidy that we have to provide to solve the problem of incomplete insurance? Do we have to provide $1.3 billion a year to primarily foreign-based now insurance companies to sell policies to farmers? Some of them are Australian and some of them are Irish. So I have to be careful about what I say here. So clearly the answer is yes. And do we have to continue to provide in a year like 2012? Does the government have to wind up paying 2/3 of the claims? $17 billion in indemnities paid out last year. We paid, the government paid, you all paid, $12 billion of that. And because of the risk-sharing arrangements that the insurance industry has with USDA. So they're incredibly important questions because this is a really, really costly program. And Congress is having to make tough decisions. And as we make those decisions, we ought to be mindful of not only how do we help farmers, but how do we meet our obligations to our trading partners? How do we make sure that we're producing food in a way that meets our environmental goals? How do we make sure that we're feeding the hungriest among us? And by and large, we're not making those decisions probably with the right values in mind.
So John, let me turn to you. You've heard some of the criticisms of the common agricultural policy in Europe. I think now there's an implicit criticism coming from Australia about farmer supports. There's the explicit criticism coming from the U.S. regulators and farmers we heard on the previous panel. I've been fortunate enough to travel in Europe 4 or 5 times over the last 10 years with my family, and I must say one of the attractions of going to countries like France and Spain and Italy is the food is spectacularly good.
Don't forget Ireland.
I haven't been to Ireland yet. So, and people take great pleasure in their local produce, their cuisine, etc. I guess my question for you is, do you think it's and Europeans also, we've learned, pay more for food. Do you think the extra security you get from your precautionary approach to biotech, the security your farmers get from the supports, are more than rewarded by the quality of the food, the stability you get in the sector, the safety of the food? I'm kind of trying to help you out here a little bit.
I was just going to stand up and everyone could walk by and punch me if that was... I was getting a bit worried earlier on, but... First of all, thanks to CropLife, because I have to be honest, last year I came here, and as you said earlier, I'm a farmer as well, like Chris. And I don't think CropLife can be accused of preaching to the choir. I think we found that out today as well, because there was the panel here last year with food bloggers. And I was sitting back there and I was getting really angry. And Charlie Stenholm, who I saw here earlier, stood up and broke the ice and said, you know, I've listened to you and I've learned from you. So I could get up there and talk, counter an awful lot of what I heard earlier on, but let me stick, first of all, to the point.
But please do counter it. That's the whole idea is to have an interchange.
So the Common Ag Policy, like the Farm Bill, was born out of severe need, okay? It was born out of war, out of the World War, and the philosophy behind the European Union, which we are currently presidents of the Council and very proud members of, was peace. And peace is something we Irish know a bit about as well. So how do you secure peace in 1960s in Europe? Food security. That's where CAP came from. Now, for 30 years, nothing happened with CAP. It was, you know, all the criticisms that Scott has said. But the key difference is, at the moment, and we are growing, we are now 27 member states. We have 14 million farmers, right? We have an average area of about 12 acres for those farms, okay? If you just cut out the support for that community, what happens it? You end up paying somewhere. So whether it's urbanisation or whatever else happens, the government is still paying the tab. Now, I'm going to say this as a farmer, my preference is that they are paid to be productive. They are paid to produce, if it's 30 tonnes of barley, if it's a couple of head of cattle, and to maintain their environment. Okay? So here in the US, you've got 2 million farmers-ish. We've got 7 times that number on half the land base. And when you look at an expanding Europe and you look at Romania, you look at an average acreage of about, I think it's about 5 to 6 acres per farm. By the way, I speak acres, which is good for this group, not hectares. Okay, so that's a big challenge. Now, yes, once upon a time, it was all the criticisms that Scott would have about, mainly directed towards price supports. Now with decoupling, it's become a much different animal. I'm not going to argue that it's not a voyage that we're on, but I think there's a lot of misinformation that I could tackle along a lot of different threads today, including biotech. I used to be on the GM committee back home. And at the same time, you have to put your hand up sometimes as well and say that, yes, there are issues there too that I accept.
And what's decoupling?
Decoupling is taking away from a direct support for exactly what you produce. So your target is X and you get paid. Why did we have mountains of food in Europe at the same time we had starving people around the world? It's because the whole price thing was at producing more, without more thought on that. Decoupled for me as a farmer takes away the amount I produce and gives me this payment that keeps me in business. And I mean, I'm a small scale farmer in US sense, maybe in Romanian sense I'm not. But.
So that's fascinating. 14 million farmers, and we only have about 2 million in the US. So again, one of the social benefits of the European policy is you have supported a diversity of farming across all the different countries, more small farmers, more family farmers, etc. You don't have the system that Paul described this morning, a hyper-efficient, large-scale system as a whole.
That's maybe another misnomer I'd like to tackle from today, because I think you may have got the sense that we like hugging trees and not really producing food. That's not true. So for example, on my wheat farm in Ireland, on 150 acres, I can produce what an 800, 900 acre farm can produce in the US. In 2011, we had the highest wheat yields in the world. And that's not our primary business. Our primary business is dairy and beef. So my argument is, within the constraints of the Common Ag Policy, you can now be sustainable. And sustainable to me is, I hate that word, but it's producing more with less It's not everything else that people think it is, okay? But also respecting the environment we're in. And there's been some discussion about that earlier on, and I'm sure the guys agree with this. The philosophy of a farmer is not, okay, I can't wait to pollute this river, it's going to be the greatest thing I can do. The philosophy of the farmer is, I've got kids, I want them to get the land better than I gave it. The problem is we get into rhetoric then and nobody believes us.
So I think those were three great perspectives on the income support side of farm policy. Let's move in the opposite direction. So I'm going to stay with you, John. Give us your perspective on the sort of regulatory side, the Tom Philpott story again, just to repeat the headline: 7 dodgy practices banned in Europe, but just fine here. So again, that's the atrazine, the arsenic, the poultry litter in the cow feed, chlorine washes for poultry carcasses, antibiotics as growth producers on livestock farms. So those are all, as we heard earlier, very effective trade barriers. They're penalizing both the U.S. producers and the European consumers, but there's logic behind each one. Do you want to sort of address where the regulatory scheme is, and then I'd love to hear from Scott on where he thinks we are in the U.S., and Chris can tell us where Australia is.
Yeah, believe it or not, we have scientists in Europe. I wasn't the last one expelled. I was asking Chris during the last session, do they have any scientists in Australia, but he can confirm that later on. And we do have GMOs.
But you're very emotional in Europe. We learned that earlier.
Yeah. We do have GMOs in Europe. And once upon a time, I was involved in the importation of GM products into Ireland. So we are the 4th biggest net exporter of beef in the world, and we're the size of South Carolina.
Ireland.
On grass-fed basis, right? That is done by about 80% of grass, but it's supplemented with imported protein. And that imported protein is genetically modified mostly, but you have the option if it's not, and it's labelled. And it works. The system works. I think generally, talking about the scientific assessments in Brussels, so you've got EFSA, the European Food Safety Authority, and they will come out with their assessment, which then goes to the standing committees, which each member state has a representative on, and that by and large works okay. It's thereafter it gets a little bit complicated, because politics is a science as well as everything else we're talking about. Now, when you think about this, and anybody in the beef industry here will know about the story, the little journey we've been on with lactic acid, which is quite a very, it's a simple technology. There are some member states who, beef production is just not of interest to them. Importing beef is not of interest to them. So why are they going to be particularly active on doing anything about that? Whereas it's different for us. You have to remember, in that room, be it the Council of Ministers or wherever it is, there are 27 representatives there with a very different agenda. And this is a relatively, I always struggle to use the term, is it a country or what is it? But it's a relatively new system of democracy. Now, looking at different issues like hormones and everything else, the precautionary principle does kick in. Anybody here know what the precautionary principle is? Most people you see, yeah, Jim claims he does, but he doesn't have a mic. It's not perfect. Teasing it out in my own head, I think, I'll back up a bit. We've both got the same problems at production level, at most levels of what we do. When is that ever mentioned? When, in the discussion today, when are the positives and where we both agree ever mentioned? We always get stuck into the nasty stuff first. We have our problems here, and Jim will be well versed in them, as will others. I mean, we can't import beef into the US because of a BSE rule. We have the same status under OIE. So fundamentally, I agree that we have international standard setting bodies like OIE, like Codex, but getting that message to spread everywhere else is a big problem. Pick on the Aussie.
I was going to go to Scott, but Chris, do you want to chime in? I have no idea where Australia is on this spectrum. Where are you as a country?
I think I'd rather talk, just in in the generalities and pick up what John was talking about at international standard setting bodies.
Sure.
Australia, like the US and like Europe, runs a science-based risk assessment process. Now, where that level of risk is set is really what we're talking about. And each country will set its level of risk depending on its population, its history, its disease status, all those sorts of things. So you need to always take that into account when we're talking about scientists who, in Australia we do have some, and they are Australian, so they're part of, that whole sense of who they are and how they've actually developed their thinking over time, just as US scientists are, just as European scientists are. And that level of risk permeates some of their thinking. So how do we get a system that allows us to actually trade in that sort of environment where there are different appetites for risk in the world? And really the only way we see in Australia is to have strong international standard setting bodies. And if we are to have strong international standard setting bodies that rely on the best available science in the world to set things like MRLs, to set things like the OIE does with disease status and what it means to be free of a disease and those sorts of things, that's how we actually allow that trade to occur in a safe manner. And the WTO plays an important part in that as well, and certainly we're a strong supporter of the WTO, and particularly the SPS agreement, where the SPS agreement says...
What's that? Just spell
That's
it out.
the sanitary and phytosanitary agreement, which essentially is your rights and obligations under animal pest and disease, animal and plant pest and disease. So if we're in an environment where, let's say, your level of risk might be a little bit lower than the rest of the world, and you'd like to
It's investigated. Actually, nobody did their homework before they reported that story. So they should have done that first, because we are still very much alive.
Farmers, producers are exempt from our major environmental laws to the extent that they aren't. They're incredibly lightly regulated. They've been systematically trying to exempt themselves to the extent that they are regulated or subject to our major environmental laws. And where they are, in this case, the case of FDA's authorities, they really haven't been subject to much oversight or regulation. And so, and that's not, obviously that's a huge challenge for anyone who cares about the effectiveness of our antibiotics. If you've got kids, your parents are getting to a certain age, you've had infections. I've been in the hospital for 4 days with MRSA. I bet some of you have too. This is something that touches all of us. All the evidence, especially the evidence from the EU, shows that livestock operators can be just as productive without using antibiotics as growth promoters. And this is one of those issues where FDA has really fallen down on the job. Congress is stepping in some important ways, but hasn't done enough either. I think there is an opportunity in the Farm Bill, and there'll be some debate on the floor of the Senate as well as on the House about how to use our conservation dollars to try to encourage farmers to grow more animals in systems that are not confined systems, so that the need to use antibiotics to pre-treat animals with antibiotics would be reduced. And so there are some marginal opportunities to try to encourage folks to raise more animals on grass and raise fewer animals in confinement. But it's a big challenge. I think it's one that's going to be that America's going to have to contend with in the next couple of years.
Okay. I'm happy to take some questions, but John, Chris.
Not really looking for an argument in any way, shape or form, but it's simply not correct to say that or imply that it's only the use of antibiotics in animals that has led to antibiotic resistance. It's certainly a component, and I think it's an important component we need to be thinking about in that manner. But as is the overprescription of antibiotics, and as is the underuse of those prescriptions by people being prescribed them. And in fact, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that direct human-to-human transmission is far more likely a result of that than necessarily bugs coming out of our food system. So it's just important, I think, that we keep all these things in balance and recognise that, there isn't one big evil out there. And I think that, this is a little bit the same, earlier when we talked about organics. And I know some of my friends back in Australia have almost a fear of organics about, it's going to destroy their way of farming. And I think we need to be thinking that agriculture is a much broader church than just traditional or just organic. And I think there's places in that church for each of those agricultural production systems. And we need, I think, to be putting our efforts, instead of cannibalising each other, we need to be putting our efforts into actually how do we work together and how do we find those segments of the market that actually allow us all to be part of that broader, and including listening to the way that some of the NGOs in Europe want to see things done with food. They're an important part of the marketplace. So it's a much broader church, I think, than sometimes we think it is. And it's a challenge in that sort of way.
Well, I would just say, and I agree with what you said. I think the meeting to pick on doctors is next door. And
is it?
Yeah.
Oh, right. So, good.
But my pediatrician wasn't giving me antibiotics as growth promoters for my kids. And it seems fair that we shouldn't be using antibiotics as growth promoters in the livestock sector. So certainly if animals are sick, they should be treated with antibiotics. And doctors should certainly do more to be more Spartan in how much they allow all of us to get antibiotics. Any of you have kids know you have to sort of slip them a 20 these days to get them. But clearly there's a lot of room for progress here in the livestock sector.
John, do you have a perspective on that as a livestock farmer?
A wheat farmer, please.
Oh, I thought you also said you. Oh, I thought you said you did cattle as well.
So I'm the first generation that doesn't have cattle, so you can talk about
okay.
competitiveness there if you want to. But, I want to go back to the little engine that could, again, Ireland, tying a few things, all of these things together. There's one programme worth checking out, which is called Origin Green. So this morning there was a discussion about cutting energy costs, cutting emissions. We've been following the New Zealanders because very similar production system, and they do what they do extremely well. Chris mightn't agree formally with that. But Origin Green is a consumer-driven project. So what people tend to forget is that companies in our business that are good at what they do are so far ahead of any regulations, it really doesn't impact on them. They set the regulation after the next regulation. In the case of Origin Green, we've got about 65% of our exports signed up to this. It's a cut of 20% in energy use, 30% in emissions. It's animal welfare, it's got biodiversity, and all these are measured regularly by independent auditors. Why do you do that? To sell your product because it's what the consumer wants, okay? Now you can argue over hormones and everything else, and we're in 40 markets around the world because we've got a grass-fed product, we don't feed hormones, and people buy it, okay? So I think the beauty of having people like Chris here and the New Zealanders in town as well is they see the bigger picture beyond. Every time I think of the EU and the US fighting, it's like two big fat cats inside fighting over a bowl of food when all the street cats are outside trying to get in the door. So just blow it open a little bit, which the panel earlier on did. But check out Origin Green.
And it's an Irish program?
It's run by our food board, Board B. Shameless plug, but it's worth checking out.
No, that's great.
And I also agree with Chris's point on WTO. WTO was the lever that forced us to change CAP and has been very successful. And not many people like talking about WTO here, but as you move to reduce tariffs and reduce export refunds, that's why you do it. So I'm hoping with the EU-US discussion we can get into the thick of these things as well and sort them out once and for all.
Scott, EWG does a lot of, I don't want to exactly call it consumer marketing, consumer education, I guess is the way to put it. You really try to let people know what ingredients are in their food, in their suntan lotion, in all kinds of products. To what degree do you think sort of consumers can be sort of a driver of the food system to be either healthier, more environmentally friendly, et cetera? Have you seen progress there?
Yeah, well, so, and what's unique about EWG is we do all the usual things around, in Washington. We had a group of farmers here lobbying today for conservation funding, for example. And we work on a variety of the usual legislative issues that you would expect a group like EWG to work on. But we also have a team of scientists who help us develop consumer guides that are free to the public and that ultimately help score things like cleaning products, skincare products, other personal care products, food, and so on. And because we do all the work for you, because we go through that list of ingredients on the back of the shampoo bottle and figure out which are the ones you ought to avoid, and then ultimately put a score on our website, we get more than 15 million unique visitors to our website every year. So that's probably more than every other U.S. environmental NGO combined. And so and I think that alone demonstrates that consumers are concerned about the presence of certain kinds of ingredients in their food and their consumer products and their cleaning products. They don't have the time or the expertise to sort of sort through all of the information that good companies put on their websites. And so they're looking for shortcuts, and we're providing that. And we're finding that a lot of consumers are buying products that really reflect their values. They help them avoid things that they'd prefer to have less of in their diets, on their skin, in their homes, on their children, and so on. And as much as I'm a creature of Washington, and my bracelet starts to buzz when I get outside the Beltway. They send me back in town. I think we all know that Congress has a hard time delivering on our common values and giving us the consumer protections that we all want. And I think we all know there are limits on even what this administration can do to help make sure that consumers are being protected and that they're reflecting our values. And so I think that's where the buying power of consumers has become so important. And I really do believe that. And one of the reasons after working at the grocery manufacturers for many years with Maya, that's why I decided to work for EWG, because I think consumers are really, and you've seen this, and obviously orange to green?
Orange and green.
Orange and green is a good example of this. That good companies recognize, your plug was excellent. Good companies recognize that this is what consumers are looking for. They're looking for these kinds of choices. They're voting with their feet. They're voting with their forks. And that's where much of this change is going to come from, not from Capitol Hill.
I think actually that's probably a good note to end on. We began this morning with someone telling us money was the root of all evil, but money can also be a force for change. Markets can help drive improvements, whether it's efficient use of fertilizer on the farm or conscious consumers picking products like Origin Green or the healthier products you recommend that work for them. So let me bring Jay up here, or Jay back up here, and before he gets here, please join me in thanking Chris, Scott, and John.
Well, indeed, Mark, thanks to all of our panels today, and especially to you for being our timekeeper and master of staying on point. Further thanks to all of you in the audience who've been here all day. I hope you believe, as we do at CropLife, it's been a great investment of all of our time to not just try to solve all the issues today, but to really engage in some new relationship building, some opportunity for dialogue, to think some different thoughts, to look at many important issues from angles that we perhaps starting this morning didn't even know existed. So for us at CropLife, it's been a tremendous success, but it is because of the time that all of you have shared with us and the engagement that you provided. As I said early this morning as we got started, today was dedicated from a program design standpoint and audience participation standpoint response to be a degree more international and global in focus than our previous 3 events, and I think that has been beneficial to the overall content of the dialogue and what we can pick up and drive from here. I don't believe we have done a follow-up survey in the previous 3 years to explicitly ask you for feedback, so we'll be doing that in the next few days by email. I think we have each one of your email addresses, and we'd like some additional feedback around what you think we could do with this event should we do it again in 2014. Hopefully in 2014 we won't be talking about the 2012 Farm Bill. But we will be talking more about TTIP, the relationship between the United States and Europe. I think there's been, particularly in this last panel, some really important discussion and also all day around the challenges that we face about getting more effective harmonized regulatory regimes in place that are indeed fairly enforced around farmers that are in those countries that are engaged and committed to those kinds of trade agreements. Those are the kinds of opportunities that I think are the big leverage for us to go forward to improve productivity, improve sustainable footprint of agriculture, and most importantly to keep farmers farming so that we can continue to take them for granted as much as we do today. So once again, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for your feedback by email and our survey coming in the next couple of days. And travel safely on your way home. Bye-bye.